Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Matt Sloane, CEO of Skyfire here, and we also have Ben Kroll, our fabulous Chief Operating Officer here as well. And welcome back to Skyfire Live. We are happy to have you guys here today, and happy to talk to some people other than the people we're quarantined with. So good to see you again, Ben. How's it going?
Yeah, it's good. How's it going in Atlanta?
Good. We're here at Skyfire HQ, and as everybody knows, our governor opened the state wide open, so now I can go get a tattoo and go bowling and get my hair cut and eat at restaurants and
There you go.
all that other fun stuff. So today we are going to talk about a topic that we have been asked about pretty much nonstop for the last 6 years that we've been doing this. And that is, well, not really, because 107 didn't exist back then, but you get the point. Part 107 versus COA and the benefits of both for your department's program and why you would want to do one versus the other, or even both. So I think everybody's sort of familiar with Part 107, so we'll talk about that here real briefly. But Ben, you want to tell us a little bit about what the COA is all about and what that actually means, what it even stands for?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think it's important to point out. So, we throw around a lot of terms, right? Like COA and POA and all these things. And I just want to make the important distinction that when we're talking about 107 versus COA, what we're really talking about is civil aircraft operations versus public aircraft operations. So obviously, we work a lot within public safety. So that's the question that comes up: is should I be a public aircraft operator or a civil aircraft operator, or both? So when we're talking about public aircraft operations, really what we're talking about is, and this is something I've actually been talking to the FAA a lot about this recently, and they've really come full circle on this. I think a few years ago, the FAA was really pushing a lot of agencies like go the public route, become a public aircraft operator. And I think that's changed a little bit. I think the FAA looks at it now, and I would tend to agree with this, that a lot of agencies can really do most of their missions under Part 107. But let's just talk for a minute about what what public aircraft operations is under a COA, which would be a Certificate of Authorization. So if you're operating under public aircraft operations, you get a Certificate of Authorization, which is granted to you by the FAA. And so I'm just gonna, Matt, am I able to share my screen here?
I can make that happen for you.
Okay.
I'm gonna make you the host. Go for it.
Awesome, thank you. And just pull something up so everybody can see here. And as we talk about this, some of this can be very confusing, and we try to be very succinct in how we talk about this and approach this and explain it. And still, sometimes it can be very confusing. So, if there's something that you don't understand, obviously, please feel free to reach out, or I think you can put things in the comments here, and we can read them. So.
Yeah, and I'm keeping an eye on the comments too. So if you guys have questions, please jump in and ask. We cannot see your screen. I don't know if we're supposed to be able to.
No, I don't know what's going on here. Let me try this. Let's see if that works.
Fun of live television or whatever this is.
Yeah. What's happened here is I updated my operating system.
Oh, if you want to send it to me, I can pull it up too.
Yeah, you know what? I'm just going to send this to you here. Stand by. While I do this, actually, Matt, and we'll. How about this? How about we come back to the public aircraft side? Can you just talk about civil aircraft operations and kind of maybe just talk about Part 107 real quick and what that means?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think Part 107, as you guys, a lot of you are familiar with, the civil framework if you're operating as a commercial entity. It's what we do at Skyfire. So we fly under Part 107 because we're not a public agency. And so, there's a lot, the sort of the golden rules, still apply. We're going to be flying under 400 feet above ground level. We're going to be flying within line of sight. We're going to be flying daytime only, and we're going to be flying in uncontrolled or Class G airspace. And so those are kind of the tenets. It's the same tenets that you'll see under some of the COAs as well too. But those are sort of the basics. I think the big difference between Part 107 and what Ben's going to talk about on the public operator side is that under Part 107, you basically start with no permissions and build from there with waivers, versus under the COA that you get kind of all that stuff from the beginning. So things like flying in controlled airspace, those are waivers that you have to get, some easier than others. Flying at night, you need a waiver for that. Flying over people, you need a waiver for that. All the rest of that, all of that stuff comes, with the COA. Depending on what type of COA you get, then we're going to talk about that here in a minute. So as soon as we get this going here.
So I just sent that to you. Yeah, you should have that now.
Okay, awesome. You send it over email, I take it?
Yeah.
Naturally, it's taking some time to get over here.
Sure. So, and we'll back that up. So while Matt's getting that set up, if we go back to all the way back to 2016, there really wasn't a framework for people to fly commercially. There was an exemption process that you could go through, and we're talking about using drones right now. So that's what the FAA came up with Part 107, and that was August of 2016. And as if we talk about this, we're kind of, have a focus on public safety here. A public safety agency can absolutely use 107 to have their pilots fly missions for them. And that's something that as a certificated Part 107 holder, you're flying under your license. So let's say you're a firefighter or you're a police officer and you're driving a police car or a fire truck. It's actually very similar to that. You're operating under your own license, essentially. So 107 created, so when you go in and you take your Part 107 license, it allows you to fly commercially, which means you can fly for your agency. And so like Matt was saying, when you walk out with your certificate in hand, once you pass the Part 107 test, you're limited to certain things. You're limited to uncontrolled airspace. You're limited to 400 feet above the ground, 100 miles per hour or 87 knots. All these things, limited to line of sight, daytime only. So initially it's a little bit limited as far as, what you can do with it. Like Matt said, you have to go apply for waivers to be able to operate in controlled airspace and all these other things. So that's really the civil side and kind of how that came about. Public aircraft operations or operating under a certificate of authorization has actually existed for quite some time. And where that came from are congressional statutes. And so these congressional statutes sort of outlined, Congress wanted a way for government, municipalities and agencies to be able to operate a little bit with a little bit more of their own authority, I guess is probably a good way to say it. So they created these statutes, and since they created them, the FAA has sort of become kind of the gatekeeper of these statutes, and they've had to interpret kind of what Congress kind of meant as far as these statutes. And so one of the things that they interpreted that to mean was that if you were going to fly as a public aircraft operator, your mission has to meet a governmental function. And before we even get into governmental function, it's important to point out that the big difference between flying a Part 107 civilly and as a public aircraft operator is that the public aircraft operators can actually certify themselves in regards to pilot certification, training, maintenance, aircraft certification, all of these things. So it gave them a little bit more leeway to do all this stuff. However, the flip side of that is it puts way more responsibility on the agency to make sure that they're doing all of these things correctly. And so when you're granted a COA, essentially the COA says, here's how you're going to operate inside the National Airspace System. But when it comes to training, maintenance, aircraft certification, those things are all up to the agency. And so when we talked about Part 107 being an individual certificate, the COA is actually granted to the agency itself. And so that's a really big distinction.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that, really we talk about a lot. There's some people who have concerns about people jumping in sort of too quickly into the COA route, because you have to sort of understand that that's what your department is taking on. One of the things we've spoken to the FAA a lot about is the actual process for getting a COA, which involves starting with this public declaration letter. And the public declaration letter actually certifies to the FAA that you are in fact a public agency. And that letter has to come from your city or county attorney. And we said to the FAA, can you explain a little bit more about why it has to come from the attorney? Like, what's the purpose behind that? And the purpose that they sort of let us in on was the fact that they're sort of forcing you to have that conversation with your legal department. And so, that sort of makes you accountable to them to say, hey, here's what we want to do. Here's what this is actually going to mean for us. And, this is the kind of liability that we're taking on before you actually jump right into that. So that's kind of the purpose of, this process. My point is that there's a lot of, logistics involved, a lot of liability that you're taking on as a department, and they wanted to make sure that you guys, as departments sort of understood what you were taking on before you actually got into it.
Yeah, and because I think what we saw, Matt, at least like 4 or 5 years ago, when agencies, because when we talk about the public aircraft operator statutes, that's something that's been around for a long time that people have used for like helicopters and those kinds of things. So when it first started to show up in drone programs, I think that was a mistake that some agencies make. They look at it and go, oh, I can self-certify? Awesome. Then I don't have to go through this 107. I don't have to take these tests, and we'll just go fly. But it's actually the opposite. What's happening there is as you said, way more responsibility is being put on the agency to make sure that they are operating correctly and with the right training. But it does give them a little bit more leeway to operate kind of how they want to and what makes sense for that agency. So there's some nuanced stuff there, but it's really important that agencies understand how important that responsibility is and how different that is from Part 107.
Yeah, and I've got the graphic here now, Ben, so I can share this with everybody.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
Let's take a look at that.
So if you are a public aircraft operator, or to be able to fly as a public aircraft, there's basically 4 things, like 4 really important things. One is, as Matt said, you have to be a political subdivision of the United States government, a state or U.S. territory government, the District of Columbia, or an Indian tribal government listed in the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act. So this means if you're a nonprofit, you cannot act as a public aircraft operator. It means if you're volunteer, there is a pathway. If you're a volunteer agency, it's very difficult to do. And again, there's kind of more of a process involved with that, but you must be a political subdivision of a state or US government or city, those kinds of things. You must own or operate the unmanned aircraft or have an exclusive lease on it for more than 90 days. So that's just the agency must own it before you can actually operate. Fly missions that meet the statutory criteria of a governmental function. So this one's really, really important. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, and now we'll get into it here. And this is a flight by flight basis. This means that every mission you fly, every flight that you make must meet a governmental function. And a governmental function has been defined as an activity undertaken by a government, such as national defense, intelligence missions, firefighting, search and rescue, law enforcement, aeronautical research, or biological or geological resource management. Now, that's a very narrow scope. And there's a lot of agencies out there that, like if you are a public works department, it's not really included in here. Your land management for a government agency, that's also not included in here. So the way to think about it, I think the best way to explain this, the way that we've been explaining it for some time, is to say that if you want to operate as a public aircraft operator, your governmental function must be something that only the government can do. So if you could hire somebody to do that job, you cannot operate that mission as a public aircraft operator. So where this comes into play is where we see agencies who, say a fire department, obviously if there's a fire, they're operating as a public aircraft operator and they want to use the drone to get better eyes on that fire, that is something that's included in here. And let's say the fire's done, they go back the next day, they're like, oh, we have this new station house that we want to get video from. They put the drone up. That's not considered a governmental function, because you could essentially hire somebody to do that under Part 107. So the best way to think about it is kind of in those terms. If only the government, if only your governmental function can do that, that one's really important there. We see a lot of agencies who've kind of made this mistake before of not really totally understanding this part of it, but it is a very narrow scope there for what is a governmental function.
I should add too that there's not exactly a list of what exactly those functions are. So in some ways there's a guideline, but it's not written down anywhere like, yes, this qualifies, that qualifies, this qualifies. It's you
like mission by mission, right?
right.
Yeah.
And so, and every time you do one of those flights, you have to ask yourself, does this meet that criteria? It's not a like, yeah, most of the time we meet that criteria, so it's COA. It's every single time you fly, do I meet that criteria, and is this a COA flight? So let's get to the last one, and then let's come back to that that governmental function thing, because there's a lot more to unpack there. So let me go back here real quick. So there's your last.
Yeah, and that one's pretty simple. You cannot fly for commercial purposes or receive compensation for your flight operations if you're acting as a public aircraft operator on that mission.
Right, and so that's also of interest too. So let's kind of dig into those last two. Operating for compensation or hire has become a really interesting topic of conversation with FEMA, because in the conversations we've had with them, they're actually required to reimburse your department for certain functions during a federally declared disaster. But if they're reimbursing you, then they're in a sense paying you for your work, and that can't be done under a COA. So where a lot of departments were not getting Part 107 certified, that's a situation where you're actually doing public aircraft operations, but you can't do it under a COA. So this gets into the weeds. Like if, this is one of those situations where if you have a specific question about your particular use case, talk to us offline, because it's pretty complex to get into all the nuances of it. Oh, you're on mute, Ben.
Thanks.
We're killing it with the technology.
Yeah, we're just. Let's talk for a minute about like what do you want to talk for a minute about what does it take to get a Part 107?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I'll talk about kind of the process of getting a COA and kind of what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. So to actually get a Part 107, the only requirement is that you need to go take the Part 107 test. You actually file through the Airman Management System called IACRA. So that's where your application is processed through, and inherent in that is a background check as well. So there are certain criteria that you have to meet about, the age requirement, and you have to be I believe a U.S. citizen, if I'm not mistaken, to go and take the Part 107. Then all you have to actually do to satisfy the requirement is go take the test. The test is, it's a 60-question test. You have to get at least a 70% on it, and it's valid for 2 years. One of the interesting things that we're sort of circling in on here in the era of coronavirus is that people who took their last test 2 years ago are now starting to need to take the test again, and a lot of the testing centers are closed. So the FAA actually released what's called the SFAR, the Special Federal Aviation Regulation, to give these folks relief. So if you, and this is really important information here, so just to highlight it for everybody, if you are expiring in the next couple of months, there is actually a process for doing an online renewal that's valid for 6 more months. So essentially getting a 6-month extension on having to go take the test. You're still going to have to go take the test later, but at least for now you can stay current. So you basically, you take it once, take it again every 2 years, 60 questions the first time, and every recurrent test after that is 40 questions. So pretty straightforward process. As I said, it doesn't really come with the permissions to do anything other than daytime flying in uncontrolled airspace. And so we'll talk about waivers in probably a whole different webinar, but there is a process for getting waivers to fly in controlled airspace and at night and over people and all those kinds of things. So we'll talk about that at another point. So that's the sort of 107 in a nutshell. You actually get a physical card, like a pilot's license that says SUAS on it, and you carry that around with you, and you're an airman
now. Cool. So let's talk just for a minute about the process of getting a COA. So as Matt said it earlier, you have to prove to the FAA that you actually are a government agency so that you can operate as a public aircraft operator. Once you do that, that letter goes into the FAA legal review process, and once they approve it, they'll give you access to a system called CAPS, which is what allows you as an agency to actually file for your COA. And there's essentially 2 different types of COAs that you can get. One's called a blanket COA. It's much quicker to get. And that blanket COA kind of mirrors a lot of what you get when you walk out of and with your Part 107 certificate. You can fly under that blanket COA in Class G airspace anywhere in the country up to 400 feet. And then you have to keep a certain distance from airports, depending on if it's a towered airport or if it has an instrument approach procedure. But that's all outlined in the COA. And the blanket COAs are all the same. That's why they say blanket. They cannot be amended. You cannot get waivers to them. If you needed to fly in some controlled airspace, then you would get a jurisdictional COA. Or if you needed to fly higher than 400 feet on certain occasions for certain reasons, then you would get a jurisdictional COA. And that would allow you access to the controlled airspace, so B, C, D, and E airspace. The other advantage to both COAs, actually, this is an important distinction to understand, is that when you, compared to Part 107, you go and take your Part 107 certificate and get your certificate, you walk out, you cannot fly at night. You're limited to daytime until you get a waiver for night. Well, under the COAs that are issued for public aircraft operators, you actually get night flight automatically included with that. You are required to have a visual observer. And then the other thing is you get a sort of a limited caveat for flight over people. And they put in the COAs something that says you can fly over people in situations where it's necessary to safeguard human life. And so that's obviously something, a decision that an agency would, during the mission, would need to make while they're flying. And if that's something that they determine that they need to fly over people in order to safeguard human life, then that's something that you can do with either COA, both the blanket or the jurisdictional COA.
Yeah, and so just put a finer point on that too. There is a third type of COA called the SGI, the Special Governmental Interest COA. Do you want to explain to folks what the SGI is and how you would get something like that?
Yeah. So the SGI was created. We used to call them emergency COAs, and so you'd call the FAA if there was some emergency. Let's think of an example for this. You're an agency who has a COA already for your jurisdiction, wherever you are. And you've got a mutual aid agreement with someone else, and they call you and they say, hey, we know you have a drone. We need you to come fly for us. And you look at the map and you determine that, oh, they're in Class D airspace. And so that's a controlled airspace. It's a towered airspace. And your COA would not allow you to fly in there. So you go there and you call the Systems Operations Support Center for the FAA, and you say, this is so-and-so, and we have COA, but we're operating outside of our area in this area for this type of emergency. And you explain what's going on. And you can only use it for emergencies, true emergencies. And typically they'll give you like pretty close to instant, sometimes it takes a few minutes, authorization to operate in there. So, and this is an area where, Matt and I, we talk about this a lot, where the FAA has done really well to respond to public safety and to public agencies and to create processes that really work for them. At first, it was a little bit clunky and we kind of had to get through some of this stuff because it was also new, and I think that's understandable. But now this is a pretty streamlined process, and we know a lot of agencies that have taken advantage of this and been able to use it, and has really helped out in situations where I think in the past, they had some trouble getting access there. So ultimately, it's been a great thing for public safety, and I definitely applaud the FAA for creating that process.
Yeah, and I can say from a couple of real world experiences, there was a small plane crash here in Atlanta, and one of the agencies that we work with asked for our help in getting an SGI because it was literally right off airport property. And I mean, it was amazing how quickly we got approval to fly, and we were literally at the airport. And so, typically that wouldn't have been allowed under their traditional COA. And so, yeah, they really, sort of take it seriously, respond to emergencies. They're available 24/7. And as long as it is an actual emergency, and they don't actually allow you to use it for training scenarios, which is interesting because, obviously there's going to be training that you're going to do in some areas where you might need to request an emergency COA in an actual emergency that you can't in a training scenario. But that's something that I think there's, discussion ongoing about. So I wanted to talk about, we've sort of explained the basics of the COA. We've explained the basics of Part 107. So one specific point I want to make is that you can actually have both as an agency. And so it's important to distinguish between Part 107 as a certification, and Part 107 as an operating framework. So Part 107 as an operating framework, we tend to tell people, is a little bit more limited. Obviously, you need waivers for all the specific things that you want to do. It's certainly doable, but that the blank or the COA actually gives you broader, operating authority from the get-go. So in a lot of cases, the COA is the preferred choice as far as the operating framework. But that doesn't mean that you can't go out and get the 107 certification, because as we talked about, the 107, or I should say the COA allows you to self-certify your own operators. And a lot of departments just don't feel comfortable with that. So that, they're like, I'm not an aviation guy. I don't, how do I know what good training looks like or good certification? So it allows you to go out and take that test and have a federal certification that says, I have met that standard that the FAA put in place. So you can possess a 107 certificate, and that's a great credential to have, and still operate under a COA, but it's sort of a backstop to making sure that you're getting the knowledge that you need. We did get a question from the audience here. So Jennifer Yaxall, who is both an attorney, a municipal attorney, and a Part 61 pilot, so manned aircraft pilot, she said, can you explain a bit more about why the COA is really so much more responsibility or liability than Part 107? Let's assume the agency is going to have pilots get 107 and not self-certify. She said, I understand that the agency is taking over the FAA's oversight, but in reality, doesn't the agency have to oversee their program regardless of whether it's operating under COA or Part 107? They have to oversee maintenance, safety, et cetera, no matter what. They're subject to liability regardless of how they operate. Is it just that there's more liability in terms of FAA enforcement? It's a great question, and it's one that we discuss a lot. I think that the short answer is we don't know, and I hate to give that answer, but none of this has ever been tested in court. And so I think it's hard to say what would actually happen in a real life scenario. I think the difference is that, and this is my opinion, the difference is that Part 107, you're sort of piecing together individual pilots to make a drone program, whereas under the COA, you're doing it from a department level, and that gives you a little bit more control over how your program is operated. In effect, yes, you could do it that way under Part 107 as well. But as far as where liability gets assigned or what would actually happen, if something went wrong, we really don't know the answer to that. Would you agree with that, Ben?
Yeah, I would. And I think it's really important to point out in our discussions with the FAA does not use the term liability because that's something that's going to get figured out in the courts. They use the term responsibility. And so the FAA says, if we are turning over more responsibility to you, I assume that would translate into a certain amount of liability in the end. But you're exactly right. We don't know.
Yeah, and I think there's lots of folks at the FAA legal office that will give you their interpretation of what that means, and certainly we can make that connection for you, Jennifer, if you're interested in hearing their opinion of it. But it's interpreting a congressional statute, and there's no guidance document.
And so too, you actually can get an interpretation from the FAA legal office. It takes some time. But if you have a specific question about any part of this, you can go to the FAA legal office and they will give you a specific interpretation. And I'm happy, was that Jennifer asking the question?
Yeah.
I've got I've got 12 interpretations that I recently received that I'm happy to send along to. So. Okay.
Yeah, no, I think that's super helpful. And this is part of the problem. And I think the FAA understands this as well. They're a little bit, their hands are a bit tied because this all comes from congressional regulation, but they're hesitant to say definitively do this or do that, and here's exactly why. And I think because this is still new and there's still a lot of sort of changing of the guidance as time goes on. And so Ben and I have seen over 6 years of doing this. First they said should a fire department and a police department each get their own COAs, or can they do one? And originally the guidance was, no, everybody should get their own in case something bad happens. Then the guidance became, well, actually, it's okay if they get the same one as long as they understand that they're allowing other people to fly under the same COA. And so it's hard because the guidance changes a lot. And that's one of the reasons, it's nice to work with an agent or a company like ours, is because we're staying up on top of that stuff too.
And just to add on to that, Matt, sorry, just real quick, I was actually talking to the FAA this morning and they echoed that sentiment. They're like, just be aware what we're talking about right now could change tomorrow. And that's what we've seen right? Like, one day we think this, one day we think that,
right.
And that's just been the process of it and trying to work within that.
the more we innovate in the drone world, the more the guidance is going to change, because we're doing stuff that we weren't doing 6 years ago, and we're asking for permissions we didn't have 6 years ago. So I think, it's a moving target. And to the FAA's credit, they're responsible for the busiest airspace in the world, or I guess what was before coronavirus, the busiest airspace in the world, and keeping it safe. And they've done a really good job of that. So I understand that that's the lens that they're looking at all this through, is what impact is this going to have on manned aviation and on the safety of people underneath the airspace as well too. So, so Jennifer, I hope that answered your question, and certainly reach out to either one of us if we can delve in further to that. It's really interesting to sort of look at some of the requests that are coming out now in the time of coronavirus. A lot of conversation being had about can we fly beyond line of sight because we've got this new mission because of coronavirus. Can we break the rules? Can we operate beyond what the rules have been? And the FAA has been very clear in the conversations that we've had with them, which is we're not waiving anything in a time of coronavirus. If you really have an immediate need, we will consider it, on a sort of a more urgent basis. But the rules are the rules, and we're going to stick with them until we have a reason to deviate from them. Is that the sentiment that you've gotten, Ben, as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we delved into that into one of our past couple weeks ago or something. So
yeah.
But anyone wants some kind of detail on that, that's on our Facebook page.
Yeah, great. No, so we got another question from Jeff Farley. He said, can a department get a COA and have an officer fly without Part 107? And the answer is yes, absolutely. If you are flying under a COA, you are allowed to self-certify. Now, that said, you have to follow whatever your department set up as the training standard for that department. It does not need to be 107. It can be 107, and that's certainly an option, but it's not. You're not required to fly under 107.
Yeah, and just to kind of back that up, just know that Part 107 and COA, or public aircraft operations, are two completely different regulatory frameworks. Although the operating parameters of each might be similar to each other, they're totally different. And an agency can have pilots who fly under the COA, and they can have pilots who are certified under their own individual Part 107 certificates. They can have one or the other, they can have both. Just remember, it's mission dependent. So if you only have a COA and you don't have Part 107, you're very limited to those missions that are governmental function. Now, maybe that's all you need. Maybe all you're using it for is very specific law enforcement or fire rescue purposes, and that's great, and that's all you need. So you're going to operate under the COA. As soon as you step outside of that, any type of mission that does not meet that specific governmental function, then you would need a Part 107 operator.
Yeah, and that's why a lot of departments are having, we tell people, get at least one person Part 107 certified, so you have that go-to person, or if there's a citizen you trust, or some sort of auxiliary person that you trust that has a Part 107, they can be that person for you. And in fact, they don't even have to be the ones manipulating the controls. They just have to be there overseeing. They're the remote pilot in command. They don't have to actually fly the mission. But if you were asked to go get some video of a COVID parade or whatever that we're doing these days, that would actually qualify as a 107 mission and not as a public aircraft operation. If you were flying that same parade for security and surveillance purposes, that would qualify as a public operation. And so you can see there's it's sort of a gray area. It's a very fine line between what qualifies and what doesn't. And ultimately, it's on you as the pilot to decide that. You don't call the FAA and go like, what do you think, COA mission or not? It's up to you to decide that. The real trick is that if something goes wrong, they're going to come in and go, how did you make that decision? What training did you have? What does your program look like?
If you're ever confused, if you're like, I'm not sure, is this COA, is this Part 107? I would just do it under Part 107.
Yeah, better to err on the side of having the federal certification, so you can get that determination after the fact. So another couple of things these are just sort of random asides, but like operating under a COA, you're actually required to file a NOTAM before your operation. That's something you don't have to do under Part 107. Also, when you're flying at night under a COA, you're required to have a visual observer. That's also not something you're required to do under Part 107. And so those are potential areas where 107 could actually be more beneficial than a COA. But of course, you then have to have a night waiver and have those things in place.
And monthly reporting too, Matt.
Monthly reporting as well. Yeah. So the FAA requires you to submit monthly reports about the details of all the flights you did, and send them information, so they can kind of keep track of what's happening and who's doing what. Another thing I wanted to point out, couple of questions we get regularly. It actually does not cost anything to file a COA. So let's talk about the process a little bit for filing a COA. It doesn't cost anything. You definitely can. It does cost something if you ask Skyfire to file it on your behalf. And what I tell people about that is like, it's just a question of your time and whether you want to do it yourself or not. We certainly don't push people to hire us, but just like you would painting your house, you can either paint it yourself or you can hire somebody to do it. And that's a determination you guys are going to have to make. I will say it is a fairly complicated process. It's not difficult. It's just there's a lot of steps and there's a lot of back and forth with the FAA. So hiring somebody to do it can help you shorten the time that it will take you to get it. We've done I think north of 300 at this point. So we know exactly what they're looking for and can do it more quickly. But that said, actually filing it does not cost anything. Taking the 107 test does cost $150 roughly. Each testing center sets their own price. But let's talk about the process of actually applying for a COA. So talk about the PDL and how do you actually start the process?
Yeah, so you get that PDL, submit it. I think I talked about this a little bit earlier, but you submit that to the FAA legal office once your public declaration letter is done. They approve it. They get you set up into the CAP system, and then what you have to do inside of the CAP system is actually go through, and you have to write an operational description and a program summary, and you have to talk about the aircraft that you're going to use, and you're going to have to put specs in there, and then the location where you're going to fly, and a few other things in there as far as kind of what the FAA wants to see is regarding what's on board the aircraft and sensors and those kinds of things. And like Matt said, it's not terribly complex. It's just, it takes a little bit to kind of gather all that information and figure out exactly what are they looking for here? What does the FAA want me to say? Because again, this comes back to the responsibility on the agency. So the FAA doesn't put out templates of saying, well, this is what you should say for your operational description. They're saying, you tell us what you need. What are you trying to do here? And then we'll let you know if we think that's safe and if we can approve that. So then you submit all that, and then depending on what type of COA you're getting, if you're getting a blanket COA, a lot of times, I mean, we've seen those come back anywhere from within a day to up to a couple weeks. Just kind of depends, I think, how busy they are and how full the queue is. The jurisdictional has to go through a little bit more of a safety review, because typically when you're getting a jurisdictional COA, you're asking to operate inside of controlled airspace. And so what happens is they have to actually coordinate between Washington and whatever airspaces you're trying to fly in, or whatever control towers you're using. So they'll call them up and say, all right, we want to create a procedure so that this agency can operate inside of this controlled airspace. Yeah,
no, that's great. I appreciate you walking us through that. We did get another question from our good buddy Chris Bachman. Good to hear from you, Chris.
Hey, Chris.
If your fire department has a program where all pilots must be Part 107, do you still need to identify continuing education and flight training requirements in the policy?
That's a great question. I would say, so if everyone's just 107, there's no requirement outside of them maintaining their own Part 107 certificate. As a matter of safety and practice, I think it's a great idea to have some policies and procedures developed that speak to what your agency wants of them. I would go well above it, because all you have to do to get your 107 renewal is take another test 2 years later. So you could just take your test and then not do any training or anything for 23 months. And then, that 23 months, you're like, oh, I need to go respond to this fire. And then, you haven't flown in almost 2 years, So I think it would behoove any agency to make sure that they've got some procedures in place and for recurrent training and practice and simulated missions and have a developed kind of training curriculum for that.
Yeah, and that goes along too with there's other reasons to do it too. Like, you have a maintenance schedule for your aircraft. You need to be flying it and recycling batteries at certain intervals. And the good way to do that is get some, stick time, get people's hands on. There's lots of great ways to structure continued training. So we've talked before about the NIST course and using that as a training tool. And we'll talk more about that at another time here. But, mission specific training, we're always offering training days and, all kinds of demo days and stuff at conferences. And, so those are good opportunities to get everybody to get, hands on sticks and just, keep yourself fresh, because, it's not natural to everybody to do this. And, it's easier for some than others. But just making sure that you're doing it regularly, and like you always say, train like you play. Pretend like you're going out to these calls, and when you're actually asked to do it at night in the dark, under stress, the chief is breathing down your neck. That's not going to be the first time in 6 months you've touched the drone. So I think there's lots of good reasons to do it, even if it's not a requirement. And the other thing too to underscore is that 107 actually doesn't require you to know anything about actually flying a drone. You have to understand, airspace and weather and rules and all those kinds of things, but it doesn't actually ask you, how would you fly this drone? So it's important to make sure you're doing training on that front too.
Yeah, and that's a good point too. And I just want to point out, Matt and I are, as we're both manned aviation pilots, we're both Part 61 pilots, and we have to get what's called a flight review every 24 months. And once we have that, we're good for 24 months. Now, to carry passengers, there's some different currency requirements that we have to meet. But if I just, if I took my flight review and then waited 23 months to go fly an airplane, I mean, I'd be putting myself in that airplane and potentially people on the ground in danger because I haven't, so that's just the bare minimum that we're talking about there. So I think it's important to go well above and beyond that.
Cool. Well, look, this is one of the most confusing topics that we talk about regularly. That's why we wanted to do this video this week, because when you guys talk to Kyle and Bruce on the guys who are answering the phones and getting your quotes together, this is something that they have to explain constantly. So we thought this is a good way to kind of break this down. But I think the bottom line is, there's definitely a good reason to get your Part 107 certification. There's good reasons to operate under a COA. There's also departments that will be just fine operating under Part 107. We always say, or I always say, we don't charge you unless you buy something from us. So if you have questions about this and just want to pick our brains about it, we're more than happy to talk to you guys. And then if you decide you want our help filing it, we can certainly have that conversation as well too. But we're here to answer all your questions. We have another question, speaking of which, from another one from Jennifer here. So given the downsides of having to file a NOTAM each time you fly and monthly reporting, and given that it's not too difficult to get a night waiver, couldn't a department fly under Part 107, get a night waiver, get airspace waivers, and then the only thing you wouldn't be able to do is the ops over people? Seems like that may make more sense than a COA. I think that sentiment is much truer now than it ever has been.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for a long time, Part 107 waivers were taking forever, and they were not guaranteed. There was a lot of, sort of, I don't want to say chaos, but, it was sort of, you felt like you submitted your waiver and it went into this black hole, and in the meantime, you couldn't do anything. And so I think that, yeah, there are definitely departments that would be just fine operating under Part 107 now with our current Part 107 waiver system. There are definitely places where you've got really complex airspace. Part 107 doesn't allow you to get waivers for the zero grids automatically. So those are things you're gonna have to file individual waivers for, and they may only be good for short periods of time. So like, for example, we did the authorization for Atlanta Police Department. They've got the busiest airport in the world in their jurisdiction. For them to just operate under Part 107 would be ridiculous. It's just not doable in a way that makes sense. But if all you've got is one non-towered airport or one smaller, Class D airport, yeah, there's certainly a case to be made for that.
Yeah, and that you look at like some of the busier airspaces in the country. Like we have a bunch of clients up in the kind of the Bay Area, and a lot of them need jurisdictional COAs to be able to operate, because just trying to get all those waivers and manage it, and it's just it can be a real pain. So and this is where the FAA, I think, really has come full circle. I think that they're really going like, you know what? Yeah, agencies can do most of their missions under Part 107. And that's a little bit of a change, that we've seen. So it really, again, it kind of comes down to the agency and the airspace and, kind of where it's located.
Yeah, and I will say though, to your specific question, Jennifer, it's actually very easy to file a NOTAM now. It didn't used to be. Now you can just put in an address, and you used to have to like calculate distances from VORs and all that fun stuff. Now you just type in an address on a website, and it's actually very easy to do.
Yeah, it takes about 20 seconds once you practice it a couple times.
Yeah, so that should not be an impediment, but there may be other reasons why 107 will work just fine for you. So just to mention that specifically. So I don't see any more questions. Oh yeah, go for it.
I just wanted to add on to that. So this is important. Under the COAs, there is a caveat there for first responders in urgent situations where they say that the NOTAM requirement can be waived if filing the NOTAM would get in the way of your response. So if there's an emergency and you just have to go, then they're like, it's okay, you don't have to worry about the NOTAM.
Right. Yeah, they're not trying to be an impediment. So, well, cool. I think I don't see any more questions in the queue. So as I said, if you guys need advice on any of this stuff, happy to walk you through it offline. If you go to our website, skyfireconsulting.com, there's a contact info there and you can get in touch with us. Drop us a note here on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I don't think we're on TikTok yet, but maybe one of these days. We can't keep up with it all. We're two old guys now. So, but thank you guys so much for watching and for the great questions. We always love interacting with people. This is why we do this, to help out. So thank you again to all the first responders and public health workers who are out there keeping us all safe, so we can all continue to survive through all this. And so we really appreciate you guys for what you do, and we hope we can help you keep doing it. So thanks again, everybody. We'll sign off for today, and we'll see you next week to release some very exciting new product information that we're excited to talk about. So until then, we'll talk to you later.
See ya.